All right. So we're very happy to see you here.
Yeah.
And we've all looked at that conversation you and I had, and I think I don't think you can see these folks very well, but they can see you. They probably might like to ask you a question or two. Anybody have a question for Mr. Pearlman? You all do. Okay.
I'll start. Hi, Marty. It's Kevin Devine. We're at BU together in 2014. You can't see my face, or maybe understand me.
Can you hear what he says?
Sort of. Yeah. Speak up.
I'll speak louder.
Okay.
I was really interested in your talking about Leonhardt and your experiences with Leonhardt that you talked about with Tom in the interview.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how you're seeing Leonhardt's influence in 2020, whether you see it, or 2022, whatever. But whether it's like remaining strong, or whether you see it sort of waning in certain ways, or whether you see certain parts of his philosophies, like permeating through the field.
Well, I think it seems to me, I mean, it's going to be partly up to all you guys, of course, being the next generation, but it seems to me that the field has evolved, it's grown, and so it grew out of largely what was going on with Leonhardt and his cohorts, Franz Bruggen and Nicholas Harnoncourt, others of that generation. I think we're all influenced by him, whether we know it or not, because before that, there wasn't as much focus on the sources and trying to find a way of playing that made sense out of the sources, and so influences change as time goes on. Teachers teach the students, and then those students get older and teach to their students, and it's like saying that the chain of pianists from Beethoven, it's hard to say they're influenced exactly by Beethoven's piano playing, but they are, because it grew from that, and each generation adds its own style. I don't know if that answers your question, but it does seem like it was a very important part of the development of our field.
Yeah. Somebody else?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes. This isn't the question that I had prepared, but what you were just saying inspired me to ask this question. So thanks for your interview and everything. We appreciated that a lot, and I really enjoyed how you were talking about the recordings that you listened to when you were younger, when you were like a child, and how you would know the note before you knew what the notes were called. I thought that was interesting, a cool story. And I guess I'm just wondering if you can think of any formative artists or recordings that you heard, maybe of any type of music, romantic, early music, whatever, from your youth that influenced you and made you want to do what you do.
Oh goodness. Well, when I was very young, I played piano and violin. I played violin until the middle of college, through my sophomore year, and so I was influenced by all of that. But I was also very involved in composing, as I still am, but it hasn't been as much of my public life. But so it's hard to say. I mean, I remember hearing performances of the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto that made me want to play the violin. I remember hearing at that point when I was a kid, the Grieg Piano Concerto was very popular. Grieg, and I suppose Khachaturian too was very popular, and not so much now. But when I started piano at the age of 6, I kept asking my teacher to teach me the Grieg Piano Concerto. Finally, after studying it for a year or so, she was able to give me a little Grieg piece, and that, I guess, satisfied me for a while. but I'm just trying to think what I did go to Interlaken to National Music Camp when I was, well, first time was I was 10 years old, and did and 12 when I was 12 also. I remember I went as in violin and composition, and I remember doing some conducting there. Actually, I took a conducting class, which was interesting, came in useful years later. I don't know if I don't know if that's the sort of thing. Is that the sort of thing you're asking about these?
Yeah, that's really, yeah, absolutely. I relate a lot to that. And I guess I'm asking because I think back on my own influences and what made me become a musician. You talked about the accident of becoming an early musician, and I guess I feel similarly that, the pieces that inspired me to become a musician are like the Goossens oboe concerto and things that I would never play on the instrument that I'm playing here.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it would be interesting to me to hear from each of you what your instruments are.
Okay, let's go around the room.
Oboe.
You might want to say your name.
Oh, hi, I'm Pablo. I don't know if you can see me.
Can you see Pablo?
What's the important thing you need to know about?
There you are, yeah. Hi.
I'm also Heidi. I'm Clara and I play Baroque cello.
Uh-huh.
Can you see me now?
Yeah, I think he can see you, yeah.
I'm Emmy. I play oboe and some other stuff.
And some other stuff, okay.
Hello, too.
A lot of other stuff.
Yeah.
I'm Will. I play violin, viola. I like to compose.
Uh-huh.
I don't need to stand up, but I will so you can see me. Hello, I'm Carmen. I play violin.
Okay.
But hello, I'm Gaia. I play the oboe and also other things, recorder, whatnot.
Okay.
I'm Alyssa. I play violin and viola.
Uh-huh.
Hi, I'm Joe, also violin.
Hi, hiding over here. I'm Aaron. I play bassoon.
Okay.
It's Kevin again. I play harpsichord.
All right.
I'm Ellen and I play flute.
Flute.
Okay. Good.
So this is one of 2 years. The program is sort of designed so as to populate a Baroque orchestra called J415.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it doesn't quite look like a complete orchestra here, but the others are in the other class.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, pretty close though. Yeah, they're a very good band.
Yeah.
Who, Carmen, you wanted to ask something?
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
On the topic of recordings and things, I was looking at your discography and listening through some things, and I was noting that Baroque orchestras now seem to be faced with an increasingly large and diverse repertoire, especially for wind instruments, having to keep track of all these different styles from different centuries and stuff like that. So what are some of the challenges and rewards of maintaining such a repertoire that spans centuries and different tunings and different instruments and stuff like that?
Well, let's see, how many centuries do we, I unlike some people, I have never really wanted to go very far into the 19th century. I love 19th century music. I listen to it a lot, but it's not something that I've felt a great desire to perform. So our repertoire pretty much, well, obviously we do Monteverdi, so that's, beginning of the 1600s. And the latest, probably the latest thing we've done is maybe Beethoven's Ninth, which is 1824. So that's the range. It overlaps somewhat with modern symphony orchestras, but not a lot. How do we keep it going? Well, we have a roster of people, both for chorus and for the orchestra. And we have members of the orchestra, some members, some who are not members, but who are called in to play with us. Membership is an official designation that has certain obligations to it. and some people just don't play that much. For example, our clarinets, you know, so you can even do whole classical programs as we recently did that don't even use clarinets, or you know, any Baroque program is unlikely to, very few places. So some people get called in occasionally. Some people get called in all the time. You know, so that's the way. I remember when we started out years ago, I sort of saw the evolution of the group as being one of expanding the repertoire. So we started doing concertos and Baroque concertos and that sort of thing, because I started with only 8 people in the very beginning. I mean, we could do 1 and apart concertos. And then as it grew, we could obviously do more music, but there was a point at which I wanted to do some, you know, Bach cantatas and some things that required chorus. So, you know, I added the chorus. And then there was a point at which, back, I guess around early 80s, where we, I wanted to be able to do some operas. So, you know, we got into ways of producing operas. And I guess the last thing was going late into the early 19th century. So that with Beethoven, you needed certain other instruments, like the clarinets, for example. So it was just a process of building a roster that could of good players. And I have to say that when we started out, these players weren't available. I mean, there weren't people who could really play them well, and just very, very few. And so it was a matter of developing the field in a way. I remember that in the early days, I was trying to encourage players who played modern instruments but seemed to have the kind of sensibility that they could do this music. You know, if they were told, you know, what to do in a rehearsal, they could do it. Some people are not oriented that way. You know, so I would try to bring in more violinists in that way. I actually, early on, in the early days, I remember buying a couple of trumpets and lending them to some really good trumpet players and say, here, learn this, figure out how it works. And, you know, that was the early process of expanding the repertoire.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Alyssa. I guess I was wondering if you could expand on what the process looked like for you in the early stages with like sourcing instruments and like music and finding historical information and then dispersing it to the orchestra to like come up with a unified kind of idea.
I'm sorry, some of your words are getting lost in this. Could you say it, try it again?
Sorry, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about like the early process of starting an orchestra, about like finding instruments and music and historical information, and about how to like get a unified group when you're all like learning it for the first time.
So is I much
Your
as I
very early day, your very early days, putting it all together. When
yeah, how to get
people in University Lutheran Church, and where do you find the music? And what about the fact that people can't play the music or whatever?
Right.
What was it in the really early, is that sort of?
Yeah.
Talk about the pioneer spirit, Mark.
Yeah, well, it was when I started, I basically got together all the people that I knew who could play reasonably well on these instruments and play them in tune and technically okay, but it wasn't very many people. As I said, it was, you know, I started with just 8. So, you know, I had 1 and apart strings, I had a recorder player and a flute player, you know, just, it took a few years. I remember at one point, a couple of oboists came who had studied in Europe, and because there was a little more going on in Europe as far as teaching this went. So I was able to add some of them. The instruments were sometimes a problem. I know that when we started out, I believe that we had the only Baroque viola in the country. So we were able to, of course, we were the only Baroque orchestra. So that was all, that worked. But finding the instruments was really, it was a question of people more or less came with their instruments. When they studied the instrument, they would come and they'd have the instrument. But horn players were sort of modern players at first. A lot of horn players, even these days, modern players like to fool around with not using valves. And so it was just a matter of sort of getting some people to be serious about it, really learn how to do it. One of the problems with horns is that as you probably know, for every key you play in, you have to have a different crook on a period horn. And so that means that when you're, let's say you have 20 measures rest, as they often do, and then you have to come in, you have to know the feel of where that note is on the horn. And it's different for every crook. And that's something that modern players can't really do until they have a lot of experience on a Baroque horn. So, there were a lot of those kinds of challenges that we had. Stylistic things were partly a challenge, but my feeling is if you have players who can adapt, who can, if you're very clear about what you want and you work with people for a while, you just get the right kinds of players and they get into a style of playing. So you can kind of teach it in that sense, and working with the same people for a number of years, you begin to develop that style. But in the very beginning, actually playing in tune on these instruments was an issue. Now you just tell people, if something's a little bit out of tune, you tell them the same way you would a modern orchestra. Your C sharp is a little too flat or whatever. But in those days, they had to really figure out where the notes were, because it was on the strings to match what the oboes could do, and it was a complicated process. I hate to think about listening to our performances from back in the 70s, but it was interesting when we started out. We started out playing in a church. I just put together some concerts that I wanted to do, and I had no idea if anybody was interested in hearing this, but I wanted to know what it sounded like, and the place filled up immediately. There was a tremendous interest. I don't know if it was just Boston, or certainly it was the time also. People were very curious about what this was going to be. And so we had an audience immediately and had some good support. And as we expanded and got into bigger pieces, people were very curious. I mean, like the first time, I remember we did the first time the Mass in B minor back in '81. And everyone was wondering, the Globe actually wrote an article, can it be played on these instruments? Well, obviously it had been written for those instruments. Somebody had played this music, but at that point, it wasn't clear whether, to them anyway, whether the resurrection of these instruments had advanced far enough. And so there were a lot of firsts back in those days, and it was exciting in a way. I mean, it's still exciting, but in a very different way. Now, really, it's more mainstream. It's more like doing a symphony orchestra concert. It depends on the success of it. Depends on whether you do a good performance. It's not just illustrating something. You're not just showing people that something can work. We know it can work. It's a question of. So we're in a very different phase of early music now, from when everything. Also, I think you were asking something about this too. A lot of this music was just not available, and we had to go finding it in libraries or manuscripts and copy it out. We had a lot of cutting and pasting of parts because they just didn't exist, and you couldn't do it on a computer in those days. So it was very, piecing things together, making it happen.
Hi again.
Hi.
So I'd be curious to know, you've been doing this for so long, and I'm sure you've noticed the landscape of early music change so much, and also the impact that early music has had on the greater classical music world in this country and beyond. So I'm really curious to know, what are some things you think from early music pedagogy or performance practice that have sort of penetrated into the mainstream? And what are some things that are maybe, the mainstream classical music tradition has been hesitant or resistant to adopt or take seriously?
That's an interesting question, complicated question. Some things have really changed. I mean, in certain pieces, for example, tempos in Baroque music have been very influenced by the early instruments. When first time we did Messiah back in the early 80s, it really shocked people that it wasn't in those days, Messiah was very, very slow and reverential. To me, it was kind of boring, actually. But I, at that time, I felt fortunate in a way that I had not grown up hearing Messiah. And so to me, it was another wonderful piece of Baroque music. And I could approach it as I would any other Baroque music, that, looking at certain figuration and it feels like it goes a certain way, rather than taking it out of the church traditions that had developed. So it was a shock to audiences. People loved it, and we had to keep doing it. I didn't intend originally to do it every year, but we have done it every year. But I think that's one thing that, I mean, if you hear Messiah now with a symphony orchestra, it tends to be, quicker tempos. A lot of the details of the styles are not there very often in symphony performances. The kind of detailed dynamics where you have this kind of almost spoken quality in the music, where individual notes will have shapes in their dynamics. That's not necessarily a part of the style of a symphony orchestra that's used to playing 19th century music. And it's a challenge when you go and conduct one of them to get that kind of feel for it. But I remember years ago, some of you will know the name Honor Bijlsma, who was a great Baroque cellist, contemporary of Leonhardt, played with him a lot, but came to this country. And there was a period when he was coming to Boston. I don't know if he went, maybe New York too, I don't know. But he would come to Boston and play concerts of all the Bach cello suites on Baroque cello. And here was a truly great musician. He had been the principal cello of the Concertgebouw Orchestra, and then gave it up to go into Baroque cello. I know the cellists of the cellists and other string players of the Boston Symphony used to come to those concerts, and they were very influential on them. So, I mean, I think you can hear good performances of Baroque music on modern instruments. I'm not against it. It's there are things that we may do and we may have learned about the music that is very different from what they do, but but the performances can often be, not always, but can often be very convincing and but different, but in a different style. So I think, you know, nowadays people have heard this kind of music played in that way. And you know, if you don't mind, Tom, just to tell one story about that.
Is there something, is it, well, all right, Marty, you wouldn't tell anything about me that would embarrass me too much, would you?
I'll try not to embarrass you. Yeah.
Okay.
No, but no, just this feeling that you can have a great performance. I mean, you know, anybody who plays harpsichord, for example, knows that pianists like to play Bach and they like to play Scarlatti and so on. And you know, sometimes you can have a very good performance, but it's like a different piece because the instrument changes. It doesn't fill the instrument in the same way, and they have to play differently. I once asked Ralph Kirkpatrick. I had studied with Kirkpatrick at Yale at one point, and maybe some of you know of him. He was a student of Landowska, and he was a well-known harpsichordist at one point. And he's the one that wrote the main book on Scarlatti, the biography, and he actually the numbering of the Scarlatti sonatas are K numbers, they're Kirkpatrick numbers. He got very interested. He started playing Scarlatti and recording him. And I don't know if some of you may have heard his recordings. They're like little crystalline pieces. They're not the big kinds of sounds that you get out of Scarlatti sometimes on the harpsichord, but they're very beautiful. And I asked Kirkpatrick. So Horowitz asked Kirkpatrick if he could play Scarlatti for him and get his impressions. And I asked Kirkpatrick one time, what was it like to give a lesson to Vladimir Horowitz? and Kirkpatrick, who is not a modest man, sort of sat up and he said, some of what he was doing was just all wrong. And then he thought about it for a moment. He said, but it was so beautiful that I couldn't say anything. And, you know, it's just different music, but it can be very well done on modern instruments.
That's a great story.
Yeah, hi. I wanted to ask you about your composition.
Yeah.
You know, is there any, I know you said you don't really write for historical instruments, but is there any overlap in what you do with composition and conducting and performing? Or are they totally, do you feel like they're totally separate? Or how do you think about that?
I don't think of them as separate. I mean, they're all part of me. And so they, you know, everything is influenced by everything else. I've always felt more kinship between Baroque music and modern music than I do between Baroque and the Romantic period. It just always feels like it's more similar in spirit somehow. And just being oriented towards composition, I think it affects the way I perform, because I don't take necessarily a piece as given. As a given, I see it as something where he could have gone this way or he could have gone that way, the composer, and why or how does he go in this direction? And that makes it, for me, it makes it much more alive. It's a piece that's kind of it got choices in it, and you see the notes and the intervals causing things to happen, and other possibilities as well. Of course, we all do that in a sense when we improvise ornaments or plan out ornaments, whatever we do with them. But to have the basic piece be something that's a living organism in that way, where it could have gone differently, I think it's influenced by my doing composition. I mean, as you say, I don't write in a Baroque style, although I do write ornaments for singers, and I'll write cadenzas sometimes for concertos for people, but it's very modern music. Yeah.
Other questions?
Sure, I guess this isn't fully formed, but it's kind of in the same vein. Well, I was kind of curious why you don't, if there's a particular reason that you don't, and maybe that's a little provocative. But I also was wondering about, I guess, you obviously have, as Paula said, you've seen the landscape change so much, and it's not really a novel thing anymore to play on period instruments, and especially in a town like Boston. I went to school in Boston, so you were actually probably my early introductions to historical performance, and I remember seeing Pompeia for the first time.
Oh yeah.
And everything, it was fantastic with Amanda Persett. But anyway, all to say, that's definitely not a novel thing in certain places anymore, and it's become kind of more mainstream and then institutionalized, which just changes so much. And I'm wondering how you, as a leader and making so many artistic decisions, how have you changed the way you think about programming and just the way that you engage with your community, like the Boston community, and specifically, you mentioned also, trying to diversify and make it more of an inclusive thing. And I think in the interview, you kind of mentioned that, we at a point were just kind of grabbing people from the modern world and trying to convert them, so to speak. But now we're at a different place where I think a lot of people in this program are straight out of undergrad or even did it in high school. Alyssa, one of our violinists, so, she was introduced to this much younger. So I'm just kind of, again, not fully formed, but that's where my head is right now.
So your question is?
Well, so one question was, I'm curious why you aren't interested in kind of composing in the older style, or composing for your own ensemble. And then also another question would be, what artistic decisions are you making now that are wildly different from those that you would have made when you first entered the field? And then I guess a third question would be, from there, like how are you engaging with your audience and your community, given that we're in a post-George Floyd world, and we do something that is pretty, can be considered pretty white supremacist-y.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Well,
that's a lot.
that's right. To take your last one first, there is, for very good reason now, a great interest, and I'm not just talking about Baroque players, but I'm talking about in the whole music world, a great interest in rediscovering composers who were ignored or are not remembered, particularly Black composers and women composers. And there are a lot of performances, and in fact we just did a violin concerto just at New Year's. We did a violin concerto by the Chevalier Saint George. I don't know if he's been played a certain amount lately. Who is the son of a white plantation owner in the Caribbean, and one of his Black slaves, and who made a huge career in Paris. He, in fact, was one of the people that commissioned Haydn. He was a conductor and a virtuoso violinist and a composer of all kinds of operas and concertos. commissioned Haydn's Paris symphonies and conducted the premieres. The problem is, for those of us in early music, the problem is that there are very few, there are women composers who are very interesting composers who are being resurrected, but very, very few of them have written orchestral music. Partly because, if you're going to write orchestral music, you have to have the opportunity to have an orchestra to perform it. And those opportunities just weren't there that often until much later. So the composers like Barbara Strozzi and others who are really interesting composers tend to write smaller pieces that an ensemble like mine can't play unless we do a chamber concert. And as for for Black composers or any non-white composers, there very few had the opportunities to write for orchestra, because you had to have access to an orchestra, and that didn't really happen until, well, somewhat in the late 19th century and then into the 20th century. So we're very limited in a sense in what kind of orchestral repertoire we can do. The Chevalier Saint-Georges is a great discovery because it's wonderful music and there's quite a bit of it. But I think it's important and both for performers performers in the field and for the composers. As for performers, it's always been an interesting problem, a difficult problem for us, because we as period instrument players draw on the field of regular modern instrument players. There are beginning to be some who, as you say, who have grown up with it, but most people start with a modern instrument. And the modern instrument field has very few, well, it has lots of women, of course, and it has lots of certain ethnic groups, but it's been all traditionally short on Black performers, which is really a problem for us. It's interesting, we've been talking lately, I mean, we've always had singers, of different ethnicities. And we've been talking lately about the fact that, I don't know, I mean, I've been told, I don't know this firsthand, but I'm told that very often singers of various ethnicities tend to be steered by managements towards certain kinds of repertoire. And sometimes by listening to them, you can hear that somebody might have a appropriate voice for the kind of music that we do, but doesn't get promoted that way. And that's a kind of a effort to diversify that's possible for us and that we work on at this point. Yeah, so it is an issue in our field, no question. I think you were asking why I don't write earlier music, or
Yeah, I guess, well, considering everything you just said and kind of the lack of, you can only do so much in terms of diverse composers on a program because we're dealing with what we're dealing with in certain sense. But I just find that interesting that you don't, is there a particular reason that you don't seek out compositions for old instruments?
Modern compositions for old instruments?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, as a harpsichordist, I've played plenty of contemporary music and written some. For my own writing, it just doesn't fit the kinds of styles, emotional styles. I mean, you could always write in somebody else's style, in an older style, but that's not authentic. It's not really who you are. And you know, if I'm going to write emotionally to what I really want to write, I'm a modern person, and I'm going to write, you know, for the same reason movie makers don't make movies like they did back in the 20s or 30s. You know, you don't write, if you're going to be authentic and really write something that comes from inside yourself, you know, don't write in an older style. I've written, as I say, some for, well, mostly harpsichords, not other Baroque instruments particularly. In fact, I had a chamber opera recently that has 3 harpsichords in it. But you know, it's not really music that they're playing, actually.
How could it be? The harpsichord.
Yeah.
You have another question, Kevin?
You just need to plug your computer in because you have a low battery.
Oh, I do? Oh, okay. I'll do that. Thank you. Is that all you wanted to say?
That's all I wanted to say.
Marty? I'm just gonna plug something in here. One of the things I wish we talked about, well, we talked about more important things than that, so we did, is all the recordings that you did, especially in the 70s. Everybody probably knows that the original name of Marty's ensemble was Banchetto Musicale. Is that right? Did you freeze? You were Banchetto, and then you changed your name to Boston Baroque, right?
Right.
And part of that was to have something that people could pronounce that would fit on the front of a record album, right?
Yeah.
And so,
yeah.
When I think about Boston Baroque and some other ensembles too, who grew, who were very much helped along by the recording industry.
Yeah.
And I think that's true of your ensemble, isn't it? You had you put out an awful lot of recordings.
Yeah.
And that's not there nowadays. But how do you see the industrial or professional future of this room full of people here when there's not going to be Harmonia Mundi saying, "I'll give you a 20 record contract"?
Yeah. Well, that's true. Yeah, the Telarc contract, when we got that, made a big difference for us. I think you just have to be really flexible and open. I mean, right now, streaming is much more important than in fact, we were talking to a record producer. Once Telarc went out of business, we switched to to Lynn Records, which is a kind of audiophile label in the UK. And we were talking to the head of that, and he was saying, at this point, I mean, I was surprised to hear this come from a record producer, but he said, at this point, if you want a hard copy CD, it's either for vanity or it's for being eligible for a Grammy. But if you really want to reach people, it's streaming now. So we've gotten very much into streaming. I mean, we're kind of forced into it in a way by the pandemic, but it's been wonderful for us. We started by putting things. We had good videos of our concerts. We started putting some of them online and putting them on Amazon Prime and on our website. And then we got this. We were asked by Adagio, which is in Berlin, goes to 160 countries. We were asked by them to stream our whole subscription series, and so we found that, first of all, at this point, a very large portion of our income in this age when we can't get big audiences into a hall, a very large portion of our income comes from the streaming, but also we have subscribers now on 5 continents. And you know, we just couldn't have done that before. We have subscribers on 5 continents. We have people who moved away, used to be in our audience, who have now come back because they can watch the streams. People who have gotten older and don't like to go out at night to concerts have come back, become donors and subscribers. So that's very much part of what so when we go back into the concert hall, we're going to have to keep the streaming going, and you know, high quality streaming is very important. We've been doing it from WGBH, the radio station, where they've got fantastic, you know, equipment for doing good streams.
So there's hope for the future, you think?
Well, yeah, it's just that I think one just has to look around and see what's happening.
Yeah.
You know, there are always changes.
You might have urgent comments they need to make. Otherwise, we should probably move on. Marty, I don't know how to thank you for, and I know everybody else in the room is more grateful than I am for your wisdom and your long experience. It's really cool. It's really a privilege and an honor and a lot of fun to have you here in the room with us at Juilliard. And I hope one of these days,
Well, thank you.
you'll come join us in the flesh. But meanwhile, thank you very, very, very much.
Well, thank you. It was fun for me too.
Thanks so much, Marty. We enjoyed it very much. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Bye.
I heard screaming every time. We need some high.